Welcome back to another glass-shattering and Hans Gruber-splattering episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that scrounges through the many floors and offices of the video game industry for the most interesting and desperate development stories. Now, if you consider yourself an eagle-eyed and/or brained viewer, you might recall that in our last episode, I stealthily name-dropped Bits Studios, the developers behind Rogue Ops, Constantine, and the SNES version of Wolverine Adamantium Rage.
Wolverine.
But this week, I'll be focusing my sights on the very first project they worked on for the 6th generation of video game machines, but one that absolutely did not start there. In fact, it didn't start off as a lot of things, as we'll soon find out. So grab your sweatiest white undershirt and your most trusted stolen machine gun as I answer the question, what happened to Die Hard Vendetta?
Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker.
London-based Bits Studios was quite prolific throughout the 1990s, developing a ton of licensed titles and ports for the likes of LJN and Ireme, and eventually becoming chummy with a little indie company named Nintendo, who published 2 of their Game Boy Color efforts, R-Type DX and the legendary Warlocked. Around that time, they were also looking to make cutting-edge, all-original IP to hopefully break away from the never-ending cycle of cartoons, superheroes, and action films they had found themselves in. And thanks to their already existing relationship with Nintendo, Bits, which stood for Belief is the Solution, decided to go all in on the N64 and planned not 1, but 3 different titles for it. A plan which wasn't dissimilar to Rare's successful period of developing for the console throughout the mid to late 90s. These 3 titles consisted of Thieves World, a stealthy heist game featuring a female protagonist, Rika, a more Metal Gear Solid-esque action game that had at one time dazzled Nintendo so much they were interested in publishing it, and finally a high-octane first-person shooter called Muzzle Velocity. Unfortunately though, as promising as all these projects were, each one befell a fate that would either cause them to become something completely different or ceased to exist altogether. Thieves World went through several iterations until it eventually turned into Rogue Ops for the GameCube, Xbox, and PS2. Rika was continually delayed again and again until Nintendo seemed to lose interest, while Muzzle Velocity wound up catching the eye of another, very different publisher in Fox Interactive. While obviously known for their vast catalog of licensed fare such as The X-Files, Aliens, and The Simpsons, just literally cut to any Simpsons clip, please.
Dear Die Hard, you rock. Especially when that guy was on the roof.
That'll do. Back then, Fox also put out original franchises like Croc and one-off releases like Motorhead or N2 Nitrous Oxide for the PlayStation. But while they were interested in the technology and action of Muzzle Velocity, they felt the concept needed additional marquee value, so the idea of attaching one of their franchises to it made a certain amount of sense. And you can't really fault the thinking. GoldenEye for the N64 was doing blockbuster numbers at the time, and hell, the Die Hard franchise itself had enjoyed plenty of video game success with both the Sega beat-em-up and Probe Entertainment's Triple Threat trilogy action game. Therefore, getting another up-and-coming British studio to develop a Die Hard-flavored first-person shooter seemed like a no-brainer, which is exactly why Fox did no such thing. While only 3 years old at that point, Die Hard with a Vengeance had been a box office success, but for whatever reason, Fox Interactive's first inclination was that they needed to promote something more current. So what film was hot? What did Fox pitch instead of John McClane blasting baddies out of a building? Well, that would be Sandra Bullock slapping saps on the high seas. Yes, Fox proposed a game based on Speed 2 Cruise Control, which would, for a time, cause Bits to have to figure out some way to take their largely urban-based FPS to work within the confines of an out-of-control luxury ship. Now, if you can believe it, this baffling decision wouldn't even be the weirdest fact about this entire project, because the development of Die Hard Vendetta still had plenty more of those left in the chamber. Once Speed 2 cruised into critical and commercial failure, as well as very public derision, it's often cited as one of the worst sequels ever, plans to promote it further with a video game were quickly scuttled. Funnily enough, one of the reasons for the backlash to the film was the lackluster script, which might have been due to the fact that it was never written with the intent of being a sequel to Speed. Originally, its script was made for a completely different standalone action film called Troubleshooter, but it kept being passed around and passed on by various movie studios as the idea of a runaway ship simply wasn't deemed as very compelling. Then, in the definition of a full circle moment, Troubleshooter was rewritten as a Die Hard vehicle and might have actually become the third movie in the series. That is, until Bruce Willis thankfully rejected it on the grounds it wasn't very good. God, I guess I gotta do Speed 2 now. Jesus. Anyway, back to video games. With cruise control out, Die Hard was back in, and thankfully the work Bits had already done on muzzle velocity wasn't too far removed from the types of scenarios typical for action films. The original premise had centered around a SWAT team member named Jack, who had to take down various violent gangs running amok in downtown LA, which meant McClane wouldn't be too out of his element. Still though, they had a lot of work to do in regards to rewriting the story and scenario to tie into the previous films, with the most obvious being the main villain, Piet Gruber, son of the late Hans. To get a bit more insight into this phase of development, I spoke to Derek Siddle, an artist who worked directly on Vendetta, as to how Fox and Bits got on once the game transitioned over to Die Hard. I do know that there were some good relations between Fox and Bits. However, my view was that they were less interested in gameplay and more obsessed over their IP and story/dialogue. I certainly felt the games industry back then had more aspiring filmmakers than gameplay designers and producers. The term cinematic experience was often bandied around. That being said, many of us were all new to this. We all came from a world where games were super hard with obscure puzzles, where it was almost expected that players would not finish a game. I cannot speak ill of Fox or Bits, but I will say this: we did not always see eye to eye and many times struggled to understand each other's point of view. Now, during all of that, things weren't going smoothly with Bits' other projects either. While Rico was meant to be a system-selling showpiece for the N64, as its development dragged on, it was clear that the aging hardware didn't have much gas left in the tank, especially when Nintendo started showing off Dolphin development kits behind closed doors to various studios throughout 1999. This caused many games that started life on the N64 to either be cancelled or hopefully jump over to what would become the GameCube, and unfortunately, in Rika's case, it turned out to be the former. This meant that a lot of pressure was put on Die Hard 64's development, even though its existence hadn't even been made public up until that point, outside of mere speculation, of course. These waters were further muddied when in March of 2000, IGN straight up asked a Fox Interactive producer about the status of the rumored Die Hard 64, to which they replied, and I quote, "The game is just a rumor, and to be honest with you, I don't see it coming to fruition." While many took that to mean it was cancelled or never existed to begin with, the truth was a bit more cheeky. Die Hard 64 was indeed never coming out, but Die Hard Vendetta was. It was decided that since the N64 had petered out faster than expected, that the project would transition over to the GameCube, which was convenient as Bit Studios' relationship with Nintendo had given them access to early Dolphin development kits. In exchange, Nintendo reportedly wanted an exclusivity window for Vendetta, which, while making sense, was much to Fox's chagrin, as they had historically stayed away from supporting their hardware in the past. Regardless, the team were busy focusing on the day-to-day development, which would sometimes throw some very sudden and random monkey wrenches into their way, such as implementing Vendetta's hero mode feature. On episode 329 of the Retro Hour podcast, Steve Goodwin, Vendetta's lead programmer, recalled a 1999 work trip where one of the senior Bits producers met with Fox Interactive executives in LA, which wound up giving the team a whole lot of extra work. During this trip, the producers caught a showing of The Matrix, you may have heard of it, and were subsequently blown away by the various slow-motion action scenes. Upon the Bits producer's return to London, he demanded that Vendetta should have its own own version of bullet time. Fortunately, Steve Goodwin was able to get it working within the next 2 days, and although it looked cool since it wasn't originally part of the game design, it led to some issues. Up until that point, Vendetta's gunfire was all hit scan based, meaning physics-based projectiles weren't actually being shot across the screen. So for a slow-mo effect to function properly, they needed to fundamentally change how the game handled bullets, which was a good bit of work they hadn't originally planned to do. Other problems cropped up as a result of working with the Die Hard IP specifically, such as not being able to use the likeness and/or voice of Bruce Willis, which was due to the high cost of hiring him or perhaps some disagreement with Fox. Apocalypse was a brand new IP specifically built around Bruce's involvement, but for Die Hard, it seemed to always be an issue, which is why his likeness was never used in the arcade game, Die Hard Trilogy 1 or 2, or even the PC-only Nakatomi Plaza. So Bits had to model McClane's face to be more generic, which Derek Seidel greatly lamented, as he was able to create a very accurate version of the character but was told it could not be used. As for McClane's distinctive cadence, Bits had to use a sound-alike, but even this process proved to be extremely tedious and frustrating, as Bruce Willis's lawyer had to be present for all VO recording sessions to ensure that the performance didn't sound identical to his client. In that Retro Hour podcast, Steve Goodwin also explained that to get the best performance, Bits had to start employing some reverse psychology, praising certain line readings as sounding exactly like Bruce, even though they were far from it, which caused the lawyer to agree and then ask for a retake. But when the sound-alike did deliver a very accurate McClane-esque line, they would downplay it, saying it wasn't close enough to Bruce, which produced the desired effect from the lawyer, who would then say, "Oh no, it was fine, let's move on." And while that's an issue that was relegated exclusively to audio, a bigger issue cropped up where Bits started realizing that transplanting McClane into Muzzle Velocity's gameplay style felt weird and was doing a bit of a disservice to the character. If they wanted this to truly be cinematic and feel like one of the films, plopping the reluctant and relatable hero into urban war zones just so he could mow down dozens upon dozens of bad guys didn't really feel like Die Hard, but more like Commando. So Steve Goodwin and others decided they needed to retool many of the game's levels and set pieces, wanting players to have to think on their feet with various non-lethal weapons, contend with traps, ambushes, and hostages, and having to occasionally use stealth and planning to succeed. And while Fox producers agreed with this shift, redesigning much of the game in this way led to some unavoidable delays. Eventually though, bit by bit, Vendetta slowly made forward progress, although the last few months of development still managed to throw the team some very sudden and stressful curveballs, as evidenced by two specific events that Derek Seidel described to me. The first was I got married in the summer of 2002, and I had worked long and hard to get the game to beta before heading away for 2 weeks. It seemed to be in a solid place. On my return, we had been told that the first level could not be used in any shape, way, or form. It was a faithful recreation of the Getty Center in LA. Lawyers were all over it though, and we were told we could not have it. This level looked amazing before I left and was a fabulous introduction to the game. So while the rest of the team were fixing the bugs, 3 of us artists spent 2 full weeks, nights and weekends, to create a new first level, repurposing every asset/animation to a new location. It wasn't perfect, but it did save the project. The second event that comes to mind is on the day of us handing over what we thought was the final version that our producer had to fly to Germany to hand over. We broke the build. I seem to recall we had locked the frame rate, but an intern broke the auto jump, which meant that key areas of the game could not be completed, which introduced a major A bug. The race was on to get a hold of him before that build got submitted. Tired minds trying too hard. So obviously, despite the team trying their best, the deck was stacked against Die Hard Vendetta's chances of being the next GoldenEye. Chief among these reasons was being exclusive to the GameCube, which famously wasn't the place where third-party titles tended to excel, which was further bolstered, or unbolstered more accurately, by the fact that Fox Interactive didn't seem very interested in advertising it, at least in North America. Weirdly, there were never any TV commercials produced for Die Hard Vendetta, but several were made for the UK market. And while Vendetta did eventually see ports to the PS2 and Xbox, those were also EU exclusives, which was really an indicator that Fox Interactive, the US side of them at least, couldn't really be arsed at that point. This, however, might be because that Vivendi Universal were in the midst of buying out Fox Interactive at that specific time, while establishing their own sub-label, NDA Productions, to help advertise games for the European market, hence why its logo is on the EU version of Vendetta, and was most likely why it got more advertising over there. And despite Bit Studios' good intentions, Vendetta wasn't very well received regardless of the territory, getting mixed to poor scores from most outlets, with a 7 from GameZone being on the highest end. These critiques cited the dated graphics, frustrating mechanics when it came to saving hostages, an overall lack of balance when it came to the difficulty, and various control quirks which all made for a clunky experience. And while he didn't know the exact numbers, Derek Seidel's understanding was that Vendetta also sold poorly on top of it, and despite there being internal talks at Bits about developing another FPS using the same engine, the studio were too focused on wrapping up Rogue Ops to seriously consider it. Things then ground to a halt in 2008 when Playwise, Bits' parent company, sold off all their technology and assets and quietly shuttered the studio. Not quite the exciting, explosive finale you were expecting, I know, but sometimes that's just the way it goes. Fortunately, Derek, and I'm sure other members of the team at Bits, learned a lot making Die Hard Vendetta, which, as we've seen, was a development cycle that was always under unideal circumstances. The game should have had 3 or 4 more months to polish / playtest and balance out. We were racing towards the finish line because of the time and money spent on the N64 version. If we did not get it finished, there would have been a good chance the game would have never come out. We all knew the issues with it, but we just had to let it go, learn from it, and move on. Everyone on the team / company gave their best, and while a difficult production, I had nothing but fond memories of the times and people I worked with. It was the best of times, even if it is not the best of games. Thanks once again to Derek for sharing his insight in today's subject. And if you know of any other catastrophic capers in the video game or movie industries, let me know in the comments below or send a sarcastic handwritten note over to my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!